fresh out of the oven. We got some interesting policies coming from the Central Economic Work Conference. This is the biggest occasion of the year when it comes to China's economic policy setting. Mr. Xie, among the 5 points, reducing overcapacity is still the consistent theme. Any new solutions you've read out of the conclusion of this conference that are providing us the roadmap to do it?
Yeah, you're right. The overcapacity issue has been a lingering issue in China for over a decade. And now this is the critical time to try to resolve it. And as you know, much of the overcapacity needs to be consolidated. And in particular in housing, there's a lot of overcapacity. And one of the policies that has been announced is to try to reduce the pricing of the housing so that more people can buy into existing stock, as well as policies in encouraging or allowing rural residents to become urban residents as an incentive for them to buy up the housing. So there are different ways to try to address the overcapacity issues, but policies apparently on their way.
And of course, timing is extremely important no matter what kind of policy we're talking about. We are talking about the plan for the next year, and yet urbanization is a very long process. That's one thing, Mr. Liu. The other thing is, what about the reduction of the so-called housing or property inventories? Who is going to bear the cost of the so-called reduction of these inventories?
There are many participants to the properties market. You have local governments, you have banks, you have developers, and at the end, the consumer. So if you are going to reduce prices, then who is going to bear the burden of reduction of prices? I don't think it's very realistic to think that farmers will move into the cities and start buying these houses.
At least the next year.
Exactly,
only.
Exactly. And the cost basis is also not very bearable for them. Even more important, I think, is for most of the farmers, if they move into cities and buy properties, number one, they can't really afford first and second, third tier cities. And they don't want to buy in fourth and fifth tier cities.
Right.
They rather build something at home. So I think ultimately it would be a sharing of the burden in terms of the cost, and that will be the government, the local government.
What about the change of ownership? For example, the ownership length is likely to be extended to lifelong rather than just the current limited years.
50 years, right.
Yes, that's right.
75 years.
Is that going to create a lot of enthusiasm and also incentives to buy?
I don't think it created any obstacles to people buying before. So I don't think it's going to make a big difference in terms of an incentive. There were complaints, but people bought anyway.
Very interesting. This is only one part of a so-called overcapacity problem.
Right.
That is the
Yeah.
property market. But what about the other problems? Professor Wolff, I know you are extremely interested in China's reform plan, particularly about the so-called supply side structural reform. That, of course, is a very technological term, but in a way, it is just trying to change this quality of supply, the different elements of supply of China's economy, which is now overcapacity problem. What do you think about this?
So I think it's a very smart plan. It's part of the maturation of an economy. So as economies develop and as they need to provide a different base of employment and taxes to continue to run, evolve, and grow, they reach inflection points. We've seen that in all of the emerged global powerhouses, and we're seeing it at a more conscious discussion level going on in China now. What that means is that my increasingly skilled workers in China with my increasingly evolved infrastructure need to have work, basic work that makes good use of all that education infrastructure. That's higher value added work, and that really is part and parcel of higher quality goods and service production. That's another way to solve overcapacity, because it says, let's produce more valuable, more desirable items, goods, and services, and let's get a global brand for quality.
We understand now raw materials, of course, oversupply problems, and also steel probably, also cement as well. But what about the so-called quality products you're talking about, Professor Wolff? We see the Chinese tourists going to Japan trying to buy rice cookers. They also buy the toilet seat cover. Well, these are just maybe some of the extreme examples, but will those products really provide the right kind of supply? And is the demand for those really large enough to really take the place of the current some of the supplies which are poor quality?
Yeah, so those are the essential questions. But the truth is, overcapacity means cutting corners and brutally competing on prices, which does create some of the problems that make people interested in buying foreign products, even though those foreign products, by the way, are often made in China under supervision of a foreign brand. And in order to be more stable and as a way to be profitable while cutting back on excess capacity, what you can do is make sure that the product quality is better, and so people don't go to other countries for key products. Often, rather strangely, even key products probably made in China, but under foreign corporate supervision.
Brands, that's not being built in one day, just like Rome is not. So will that be able to help us next year? We are talking about next year, 2016.
I think the overcapacity issue that the government is addressing is not an issue, it's not over issues of consumer products. I think it is much more into the infrastructure side, like housing, like roads, like highways.
Yeah, but you have to
railways.
create certain kinds of supply to take the place of the already oversupplied areas which you have just talked about. So what are those areas?
So, for example, why don't you build infrastructure for neighboring countries? Which
That's
is already
One Belt,
beginning.
One Road already mentioned
Exactly.
in last year's plan, which is implemented this year. But what about new ideas? We didn't see One Belt, One Road being explicitly mentioned, at least in the 5 points conclusion.
Right.
So any new idea coming out of this year's conclusion that might shed some light on the dealing of the overcapacity?
I think the issue of having better quality things is certainly very important for the export side. But what's even more important, I think, than quality is the efficiencies and productivity of Chinese manufacturing. China is fast losing its competitiveness compared to Southeast Asia and other countries in terms of basic manufacturing of products. So you just have to be much more productive, and higher efficiency is probably what I think the supply side restructuring really has to aim for.
I see. Mr. Xie, what about your thought? We earlier mentioned some ideas, some being dismissed by our panelists, for example, consumer products coming from China for the Chinese market, and also the brands building of Chinese product, which might take much longer than just 1 year's plan. So what do you think, Mr. Xie, where does that supply side structural reform come in terms of the year 2016, sir?
I think a full address of the overcapacity issue through the supply side reform is probably going to take some time. But it's critical for the Chinese government to begin the process, because for a long time this issue has been sort of neglected, because for a long time the focus has always been on the demand side, on stimulation of the demand. In my view, for next year, a couple of important initiatives that need to go underway quickly, and hopefully we're going to see some impact, would be number one, more emphasis on innovation and entrepreneurship, and through the innovation to try to create new values through new ideas, new business models, and new ways of going to the market, and so on. I think the other, is actually also a continuation of the support of the migration of the manufacturing capabilities from low-cost manufacturing to higher value-added manufacturing. That may or may not, see the impact right away, but it's certainly a way that the Chinese will have to go.
Let's talk about some of the points you just mentioned. Innovation and entrepreneurship, this time it is being mentioned again in the 5 points conclusion of the Central Work Economic Conference. But one thing is very crucial. Internet Plus has been a crucial idea being advocated over the past 1 year. How to make sure, quote unquote, the Internet Plus will be really becoming value-added economy or economic reality is a big question mark. We can talk about the idea, we can talk about campaigns, we can talk even about social movements, but how long will it take to add to the real economy? In what forms will it add to the real economy? How sustainable will it be? And what are some of the factors that it would need in order to become a reality? Those are all crucial questions. Professor Wolff, what is your observation?
Yeah, so I think we've begun to see a really powerful movement inside China, a la Silicon Valley, to generate and grow to dominance with domestic web-based and software-based corporate offerings. We've seen them do really well in China. We haven't seen these companies take market share very much, beginning maybe now with Alibaba globally. So I think there's some idea to project this outside of China. Also to generate a real local and smaller scale entrepreneurship with high quality product offerings, whether those are goods or services, can start online with the Silicon Valley model. And the idea there is not to say march toward heavy industry, large scale manufacturing, global competition and commodity product, but really design unique products for consumption locally and scale internationally, and start that with an area that China has made a huge investment and big strides in, which is native internet and native mobile, because after all, China will lead the future development of mobile devices, right, because it's already the largest mobile market on earth.
Well, today, Mr. Liu, in order to prep for today's program, I did visit one of the newest real estate projects in China, in Beijing. It is mainly built for entrepreneurs, even as small as just 5 or 6 chairs, working units
Incubator.
in Beijing. So, but the question is, there are so many of them, entrepreneurs over there. They're all very enthusiastic. But we all understand the success rate of entrepreneurship. Less than 5%, that is even the highest in the world at any economic point. So how realistic is it that we are relying on entrepreneurship and so-called innovation in the economic growth of our economy and the structural reform of our economy?
I think this is not an easy process.
No,
and it would take quite some time, especially since entrepreneurship, much of it is copying what happened in Silicon Valley, and not all things in Silicon Valley are actually copyable or should be copied by China under very different circumstances.
Some do adaptation, that's fine, and they're doing it very well.
That's right. But at the same time, whether or not they're really creating value for society is a different issue.
What do you mean?
Well, much of Silicon Valley has been hottest on in the last couple of years has been social media. Social media is basically to get eyeballs, to promote advertising, and then to make money on that basis.
You mean the business model is nothing innovative you're talking
That's right.
about? Is that what you're saying?
It's not only not very innovative, but whether or not it's really creating efficiencies through the internet. Now, for example, in e-commerce, it's creating efficiencies, absolutely efficiencies, in terms of logistics, in terms of supply, taking out the middleman.
Or sharing economy,
and so
it is also
exactly,
increasing efficiency.
it's also creating efficiencies. But social network, I don't think it's creating efficiencies. So whether or not they're learning from the West, or they're adapting it for China, or they're creating new things for China, like the 2,400 companies in Shenzhen last month competing for the startup competition, the enthusiasm and the drive is certainly good. And I think it's creating a new generation of entrepreneurs.
It is not just the competition you're talking about. I think in every city there's a competition like that about the entrepreneurs. Even the districts are now having competitions like that. So certainly the air is there. Mr. Xie, you talk about innovation at the very beginning. So what do you think about this real translation from the spirit into the real economy?
Well, I think, to what extent innovation can create value by definition depends on the company or the entrepreneurship. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But in response to the statement that you made earlier, I think while the probability of success for entrepreneur is indeed quite low, but I think the advantage of China is that it has a tremendous large number of people, especially young people, who are actually trying different ways of experimentation, innovation, and so on. And a small percentage of a large number is still a large number. And I think while today we see a Jack Ma, a Pony Ma, a Robin Lee, and so on.
Well,
who
they're
knows?
just one of those
2
very,
years
very
later, we're
few
going to see
among all the
a
entrepreneurs.
dozen.
Yeah, but they are one of the very few, some of the
Who
few examples of successful. Well, who knows? We hope for the best, but we have to face the reality at the same time. So
who knows?
When we talk about innovation, is it really should be translated into only mass entrepreneurship or only technological innovation? Is there something more to the so-called innovation that we're talking about? Mr. Liu here, a lot of people, investors, entrepreneurs, even government officials are talking about the governance innovation. How much will the governance innovation be able to help us to deal with our job of so-called supply side structural reform, which is urgently needed now?
I think you're absolutely right. The structural reform that's required includes management in terms, well, governance may be a more narrow definition of management, but overall, a lot of very mature technologies exist all over the world that can help China's productivity and efficiency. But whether or not they can be applied successfully in China is a different story. And that comes from management issues and government policy support and so on and so forth. I think that for many of the entrepreneurs, there are several problems that they have to overcome. One is bureaucratic management by the government. There's just too many things that the government meddle in that really should be subject to the marketplace. Second is taxation. There should be support for them to accumulate that first bucket of gold to be able to develop.
We are going to devote many more times to the entrepreneurship in China. We're going to discuss in details about those problems. But let's talk about the general and grand picture here. Professor Wolff, we talk about governance innovation. We see China's reforms over the past 30 or 40 years have gone through some interesting issues. For example, how to create a new interest, to budge off the old interests, which might be the obstacles of reform. I think the governance innovations seem to have a role to play in creating the new stakes, to take to replace rather the old stakes or the old interest groups. Can that happen from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely can happen. It never goes in a linear, straight line of progress. There are always setbacks, and sometimes the setbacks are dramatic and they take our attention. But the march forward in the last 30 or 40 years is fairly unmistakable. And if you've been able to do this for 30 or 40 years, there's no enormous reason to believe you can't going forward. I think that's part of the reason that the supply side and the entrepreneurship focus matters more than you rightly point out it can do for next year. It's about changing the questions and changing the social heroes and changing priorities while you rationalize state business. That's always slow, but if you change the way people think, it is only a matter of time before you change the way they work.
All right. Before we go, let me do a little bit survey because we only have 1 minute left. So from all the three of you, your judgment, China is having 6.5% growth rate, no less than that as pledged by Chinese President Xi Jinping earlier. What about next year? Because we all understand this time it's not going to be a V-shaped economy revival, but rather a L-shaped, not only for China, but for many economies around the world. So 6.5% possible or not? Mr. Xie.
Possible.
Professor Wolff.
Possible, but I think we should be ready and okay with a little bit less than that.
All right, Mr. Liu.
I think the same as Professor Wolff.
Which is?
Possible, but given the complications worldwide,
all right,
there could be complications, yes.